Until just a few days ago, certain things about the development of artificial intelligence were generally taken as fact, like that developing the most advanced AI systems requires unbelievable sums of money. OpenAI burns through more than $5 billion a year, and it said it expects that number to grow exponentially. And this research devours incredible amounts of other resources too, including electricity and water. We also believed that the US was ahead of China in the AI race, perhaps years ahead, especially with Washington limiting Chinese access to the most advanced AI chips. But then, this happened.
Let's talk about DeepSeek, because it is mind-blowing and it is shaking this entire industry to its core.
After the US stock market made a brand new all-time high, fueled by a 2-year-long artificial intelligence boom, investors are now speculating that the release of DeepSeek is going to pop the AI bubble, causing something similar to what happened in the early 2000s when the technology bubble burst.
What took Google and OpenAI years and hundreds of millions of dollars to build, DeepSeek says took it just 2 months and less than $6 million.
I'm Jennifer Strong, and this is Shift.
Now here on the steering column is a device called Auto Cruise. You simply set the speed you want.
Self-driving robo-taxis are already on the road in 2 U.S. cities.
As the disk rotates, a mirror reflects the light in the way that depends on how the signal was recorded.
This is the 100 terabyte empty core. I present to you Electro, the Moto Man.
Ladies and gentlemen,
I would say that one of my greatest skills is my ability to interact with humans.
This episode, we dive deep on DeepSeek.
So my name is Daniela Hernandez. I've been a tech and science reporter for more than 10 years now. And before that, I was a neuroscientist. I studied learning and memory and how the brain processes information.
Silicon Valley is, well, let's just say it's been rocked. A Chinese startup appears to have built AI models that rival OpenAI's, and they're claiming to have done it using much less money, many fewer chips, and a whole lot less energy. So what has happened here?
Yeah, it's got the world kind of freaking out.
Yes.
I mean, and for good reason, right? Like the stock market's going crazy. We are kind of living in this chip economy. And so when something rattles the stock market so much, of course, people are going to take notice. This company called DeepSeek, which is based in China, small startup, released a series of papers detailing what they did. And what they did was pretty impressive. So as you said, they built these very, 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 very powerful systems using lower quality chips and a lot less money. So according to their paper, which we haven't verified, no one's verified these figures, but they built the system for a teeny fraction of what US companies are investing. And the reason that they were able to do that is because they kind of played all these like really cool, innovative tricks in how they processed the data. Now remember, the data is the fuel for these AI models, but it's also kind of a bottleneck. So the more data that you have to process, the more compute time you need, so it's more intensive. And so they were able to do this kind of innovative parallel process such that like the training model learned more quickly. So I'm just going to paraphrase something from the paper here. We designed an innovative pipeline, which was parallel pipeline, and that's one of the key ingredients in this whole thing, which they call dual pipe. And it's important because it accelerates model training. That's really important because the longer something takes, the more money it costs. And so then they were also able to do this cool technique called mixture of experts. And so you can kind of think of it as having like, if you think of an AI model as a big brain, then these experts are like little tiny brains within them, and they talk to each other. And the way that communication happens also made the algorithm that they built more efficient.
It's a little bit wild. We're just on the heels of a huge investment in U.S. AI infrastructure, things like data centers, from the new administration that maybe we don't need or need as much. There's also just an overall sense, there was at Davos anyway, that the U.S. was still years ahead in this race with China.
Yeah, I think the fear here is that the Chinese have caught up. And that fear is rooted in a couple of different things. There's a lot of concerns about data privacy and what a Chinese company would do with our data. We're seeing that with a lot of the debate over who owns TikTok, right? Like we just were on the heels of that. So data privacy, data ownership, national security, those are all big issues. And AI is the perfect cauldron, so to speak, to talk about that because it involves all of that. AI is involved in defense. AI is involved in wars these days. AI is in our phones, in our lives every single day. Like some device is listening to me right this moment. And so if other non-allies are overtaking us in AI, of course, that is going to bring up issues.
Well, there's also this question about data and what's in these models. For example, mentions of Tiananmen Square may not surface, or other human rights abuses may not surface in models built within China.
Right. I mean, that doesn't mean that the training data isn't there. It just that means that it isn't being surfaced, right? So another issue that we've seen with AI recently is that those algorithms can be tweaked such that certain answers or information is given priority over others. But you bring up a good point in that in this case, and in many cases with AI, we just don't know what that data that's being fed to it is. And so that makes it harder to assess whether it has some kind of bias.
So I'm just kind of thinking through next steps, though. If these models become less expensive coming from China, for example, what it means if U.S. businesses, startups, consumers, et cetera, started to use models that might have certain things suppressed within them, certain things missing from them. I guess we deal with this every day already, just in a very different way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind here is that this is open source. So anybody, ally or non-ally, could take this and learn from it, develop on top of that. Some of our most valuable companies are built partly on open source systems. Facebook, when it was still called Facebook, started off with Hadoop, which is an open source platform. And so just that fact alone, can actually increase innovation. So that's not the concern. I think the concern is that it wasn't developed here and there are ethical issues that it brings up. That being said, which is, a very important point, like the technical innovation here is really, really, really interesting. The fact that their model performs as well as it does, even with the restrictions on exports of powerful GPUs that were placed by the US government. I mean, you could argue that, hardship is a fuel for reinvention, and you're seeing the tech version here.
Yeah. And going back for just a second, you raise a great point about open source. I mean, Llama Meta system is itself open source, right? But that's been one of the hottest debates over the last year or two or so, right? About AI. It's like, when is it not okay for this to be open source? When should it be? And it's been maybe a livelier debate than we've heard in quite some time about the open source movement.
Well, when you make something open source, you yourself are choosing to let the world take it and run with it, right? I think part of the debate around AI today is that it's feeding off of and learning from things that are copyrighted, that other people own, and then using that to create new things. And that in and of itself isn't terrible. But what is worrisome is that those outputs then have real world repercussions that cost people livelihoods, that, upend whole industries. And that gets back to why this is so interesting, right? Because it has the potential to upend a whole economy that we thought we were building on top.
All right, so there is a lot more that we don't know than we do know. And I mean, among our many unanswered questions here, they say that they spent $6 million. We don't have a way to know that, of course. And as you mentioned, there could be national security impediments for U.S. companies or consumers, given what we've seen with TikTok. We don't know how that's going to play out. What are some of the other things that come top of mind for you?
One of the things that I would try to keep in mind as this is happening is that it's not all doom and gloom, right? Number one, they did open source it. People can learn from it. It builds on technologies that were developed all over the world. A thing to watch for is that because we are in a tight race, this will only put pressure on American companies to build on top of this, right? And so they are still using GPU. So it isn't a complete overhaul of how the system works. They just had less powerful ones and they were able to do a lot with them. These techniques are well known to people in the field. It's just a matter of figuring out how to put them together in a way that works more efficiently. And that's what they did. What's kind of inspiring about this is that they thought outside the box because they had to. That's always really cool to see.
So among the things that we don't know yet, there are groups that are heavily wrapped up in this financially, right? I'm thinking of American venture capital firms, for example, right? Axios called the rise a potential quote unquote extinction level event for venture capital firms that went all in on foundational model companies. Now, foundational models, these companies are not going anywhere necessarily, but it seems like a lot of this work, to your point, will be done more cheaply and by more people going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one, right? Like that's kind of investment 101. You have to diversify your portfolio to mitigate against risks like this. You never know where the next big advance is gonna come from. Is it an extinction level event for LLM companies? The extinction comes when you don't adapt, right? That's basic evolution. And so given the fact that now we know that you can do some of the same impressive tasks with fewer resources, actually, that's a call to action. I mean, part of the huge downsides of AI models today is that they eat up power. They're super, super power hungry. They suck up all our drinking water, which is so important because we are in the midst of all these droughts. And my family just lived through the LA fires. And so we are dealing with a scarcity of very important natural resources that AI eats up. So now if we can get to the same place using fewer of those physical resources, that's great.
Right. And we've also heard some of this before, right? Around crypto, around other moments where, a lot of attention was being paid to something and then there was a pivot.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that this has already happened in AI. When I was covering this in the 2010s, there was a pivot from CPUs to GPUs that also corresponded with doing it on the cheap. So there was a paper by Andrew Ng, who was one of the pioneers in deep learning. He had gone to Google and built this, maybe you remember this, like this cat detector for being trained on YouTube videos. And that model cost $1 million. Now, by today's standards, that seems super cheap. But he wanted to democratize the models that were going to make the next big leap in technology, which were these deep learning models. And so he transitioned the models from CPUs, which were the bedrock of computing up until that point, to GPUs, which graphic processing units. They were for video games. And so making that switch made the models more efficient and they made them cheaper.
All right. So what are you going to be watching for with this next?
I think one of the things that this does, the authors talk a lot about democratizing AI. They mention that a few times in the paper. And they do that specifically in the context of something called a distilled model. Distillation is a process where you take what a big model, like the one they built on fewer GPUs, does. And it kind of just extracts the principles of what it learned so that you can run it, not in a data center, but like on a phone or a computer, where it could be actually a product. And so one of the big things coming down the pike that people have been talking about now for a long time, the NVIDIA CEO Jensen talked about it recently at, I think it was CES. It's the idea that we're going to have these very smart devices literally everywhere. We're going to be wearing sensors. We're going to like have smarter cars, smarter homes, smarter tractors, so smarter everything. And that's the leading edge of edge computing, so to speak. And if you as a company have the ability to build smarter systems with fewer resources, then you just have a trickle-down effect from there, right?
That's Daniela Hernandez, my former colleague and longtime tech and science editor. She's also a neuroscientist. This episode was produced by me and Emma Cillekens and mixed by Garret Lang, with original music from him and Jacob Gorski. Thanks for listening. I'm Jennifer Strong.
From PRX.